From the perspective of a specialist in the study of the Hung King's dynasties, the 10th Hung dynasty can be understood as the period in which ancestor worship no longer existed merely as a spiritual custom, but fully crystallized into a defining framework for moral values, social order, and the way the people of Văn Lang understood themselves within the flow of time. If earlier dynasties laid the foundations of collective identity through symbols, rituals, and cosmological order, the 10th dynasty marked a deeper shift inward, toward lineage, continuity, and the living relationship between the present and the ancestral past. By this stage, Văn Lang society had moved well beyond its formative phase. Village communities had existed long enough to accumulate shared memory, allowing each lineage to preserve its own narratives of origin, stories of land founders, village protectors, and craft ancestors. In this context, ancestor worship ceased to be focused solely on distant mythic figures and became a belief system embedded in everyday life. Ancestors were no longer confined to a vague, sacred realm. They were present in every household, every hearth, and every story retold during quiet evenings after the harvest. The 10th Hung dynasty marked a moment when the ideas of lineage and succession became especially pronounced. Individuals increasingly perceived themselves not as isolated beings, but as links in an unbroken chain of generations. Every action in the present was measured against the gaze of the ancestors, while simultaneously oriented toward the well-being of future descendants. This awareness gave rise to a durable moral framework in which responsibility extended beyond the self to encompass family, lineage, and community. Within village life, ancestor worship gradually became standardized through familiar yet deeply meaningful rituals. The ancestral altar emerged as the sacred center of the household, serving as a continuous bridge between generations. This space was not merely for offerings, but also for transmitting memory. Children learned about their forebears through stories of hardship, floods, famine, and resilience. History, therefore, did not exist as a written chronology, but as a living, spoken memory sustained within the collective consciousness. On a broader scale, ancestor worship reinforced the social structure of Văn Lang by promoting stability and cohesion. When each family honored its roots, the village naturally became an extension of the household, and the state of Văn Lang was perceived as a great extended lineage. In this context, the Hung King was not only a political or ritual leader, but the symbolic embodiment of the shared ancestor, the guarantor of unity among diverse clans and regions. A defining feature of the 10th dynasty was that ancestor worship was not imposed from above. It evolved organically from within the community, shaped by the natural human need to preserve memory and moral order. The Văn Lang state did not rely on rigid regulations because belief itself provided the behavioral framework. To live with integrity, honor one's word, respect elders, and protect children was understood as the most authentic way of remaining worthy of one's ancestors. This belief system also left a clear imprint on economic life and labor. Occupations were no longer seen merely as means of survival, but as ancestral legacies to be preserved and passed down. Bronze casters, potters, and weavers regarded their skills as the culmination of generations of accumulated knowledge. Each crafted object carried not only practical value, but also the honor of the lineage. This sense of inherited responsibility fostered care, discipline, and continuity within early craft communities. The relationship between humans and nature during the 10th Hung dynasty was likewise shaped through the lens of ancestor worship. Land was not simply a resource, but a place once lived on, cultivated, and protected by forebears. As a result, interaction with the environment was guided by restraint and respect. Fields, rivers, and forests were associated with ancestral stories, making it difficult to exploit nature without moral consideration. Spiritually, ancestor worship brought Văn Lang society into a distinctive state of balance. The people were no longer driven by the intense ritual display characteristic of earlier, more symbol-focused periods, nor did they fall into pure pragmatism. Instead, spiritual life became quiet, enduring, and deeply internalized. Faith no longer required constant reinforcement through grand ceremonies. It had become an integral part of daily existence. The 10th Hung dynasty can therefore be described as the period in which the history of Văn Lang was transformed into a moral tradition. The values shaped by ancestor worship not only ensured social stability in the present, but also created long-term cultural resilience. This foundation enabled later generations, even amid major historical upheavals, to retain a profound awareness of origin and continuity. In retrospect, the 10th Hung dynasty was not defined by dramatic events or monumental constructions, but by a subtle yet decisive transformation. When ancestor worship became deeply rooted in daily life, it formed an invisible thread linking past, present, and future within the Văn Lang community. This enduring spiritual legacy remains one of the most significant contributions of the dynasty, continuing to resonate in Vietnamese cultural consciousness to this day. Comparing the 9th and the 10th Hung dynasties allows us to clearly identify a profound shift in the development of ancient Văn Lang. This was not an abrupt or confrontational transformation, but rather a gradual movement from a society that had achieved internal structural stability toward one that was firmly anchored in moral order and ancestral memory. The 9th Hung dynasty can be understood as a period in which Văn Lang completed its process of internal consolidation. After many generations of formation and convergence, the Lac Viet communities had become fully accustomed to an agricultural rhythm of life, to the village tribal structure, and to a system of rituals that maintained social order. The defining characteristic of this era was the smooth functioning of society based on custom, experience, and collective memory. People lived within an established order with relatively little disruption, where rituals, symbols, and traditions served primarily to preserve stability rather than to create new forms. With the 10th Hung dynasty, Văn Lang took another step forward in spiritual and ethical maturity. If the 9th dynasty emphasized communal stability, the 10th dynasty deepened the role of family in lineage as the moral foundation of society. Ancestral worship was no longer merely a spiritual practice accompanying daily life. It became a central ethical axis governing how individuals related to one another, to their communities, and to the future. This marked a shift from a communal order to a moral order. In terms of social organization, the 9th dynasty clearly displayed a model of village and tribal self-governance. The central authority of the Hùng King remained largely symbolic and ritualistic, while everyday life was regulated by village elders and local leaders. In the 10th dynasty, this structure was preserved but further reinforced through kinship ties. Families, lineages, and ancestors became enduring points of reference, enabling society to maintain order even without direct intervention from the central authority. Spiritually, the 9th dynasty reflected a society living within a broad collective memory. Legends, rituals, and symbols allowed people to perceive continuity across generations. By contrast, the 10th dynasty narrowed this spiritual focus into the domestic sphere. Historical memory was no longer sustained only through communal festivals or shared myths, but also preserved within each household through ancestral altars, family stories, and lineage traditions. This difference is also evident in the way personal responsibility was understood. In the 9th dynasty, responsibility was primarily communal, maintaining village customs, observing shared norms, and preserving overall harmony. In the 10th dynasty, responsibility extended vertically through time. Individuals acted not only for the present or for the living community, but also for the honor of their ancestors and their obligations to future descendants. This represented a significant shift from social responsibility to intergenerational responsibility. Economically and occupationally, the Ninth Dynasty witnessed increasing stability and specialization in handicrafts, closely tied to specific communities and regions. In the Tenth Dynasty, these occupations became more strongly lineage-based. A craft was no longer merely a livelihood, but an inheritance passed down from ancestors, something to be preserved and transmitted. This development laid the groundwork for the long-lasting craft villages that would later become characteristic of Vietnamese history. In humanity's relationship with nature, the Ninth Dynasty emphasized harmony based on accumulated agricultural experience and production customs. The Tenth Dynasty added a moral dimension. Land, fields, and living space were increasingly viewed as ancestral property. As a result, the exploitation of natural resources was accompanied by a stronger sense of restraint and stewardship. Overall, the Ninth Hùng Dynasty can be seen as the period in which Văn Lang achieved social stability, while the Tenth Dynasty marked the moment when that stability became deeply rooted in moral values and ancestral consciousness. If the Ninth Dynasty created horizontal stability among communities and contemporaneous generations, the Tenth Dynasty established vertical continuity, linking past, present, and future. This subtle yet profound transition helped Văn Lang preserve its identity and cohesion over the long term, even as history moved toward more turbulent phases. Comparing these two dynasties reveals an early adaptive capacity of ancient Vietnamese society, knowing when to consolidate communal structures and when to define moral principles to ensure endurance across generations.